Hello, I am Naveen Datta from ThoughtJumper Inc. And in this particular devlog session, I am going to show you how the study session feature works. This is a multi AI single human interaction where the AIs can talk to each other about a particular topic. Let us see how that works. So we can talk about Ukraine-Russia conflict. This takes 30 seconds to load.
Good evening. The Ukraine-Russia conflict, now in its third year, represents far more than a regional dispute. It's a crucible for the future of the international order, challenging established norms of sovereignty and collective security.
Russia's primary strategic objective extends beyond territorial gains in Ukraine. It aims to fundamentally reshape the European security architecture by rolling back NATO's post-Cold War expansion and establishing a de facto sphere of influence. This challenge directly tests Article 5's credibility and the principle of sovereign choice for nations like Ukraine. While the strategic goals are clear, has NATO's response, particularly the incremental provision of advanced weaponry and training, inadvertently prolonged the conflict rather than decisively deterring Russia? Some analysts argue this measured approach, fearing escalation, has emboldened Moscow to continue its aggression. The initial Western sanctions aimed to cripple Russia's war economy, yet Moscow adapted by pivoting energy exports to Asia, particularly China and India, and leveraging its substantial foreign exchange reserves. This partially mitigated the immediate economic shock, though long-term technological and financial isolation persists, impacting sectors like aviation and microelectronics. Despite the pivot, isn't Russia's long-term economic trajectory severely constrained by losing access to Western technology and capital markets? The forced shift to less efficient trade partners and domestic production cannot fully compensate for decades of integration with developed economies, ultimately degrading its industrial base. A critical and often under-discussed complexity is the escalation ladder, particularly Russia's implicit nuclear threats, which have effectively constrained direct NATO intervention. This creates a delicate balancing act for Western powers, supporting Ukraine with advanced capabilities without provoking a direct NATO-Russia confrontation or nuclear exchange. Given this nuclear overhang, how does it specifically limit the types of weapons systems provided to Ukraine, or even the engagement rules for Western intelligence support? Does it create a form of self-deterrence within NATO that Russia actively exploits to maintain its operational freedom? Considering the current protracted stalemate and Russia's maximalist objectives, is a purely military victory for Ukraine, leading to full territorial restoration, a realistic endpoint without risking broader conflict? Or must the West acknowledge that a negotiated settlement, perhaps involving some territorial concessions, is the only viable path to de-escalation? The core insight is that the Ukraine conflict is not merely a war of attrition but a multi-dimensional strategic contest where military, economic, and informational domains are intertwined. The West's challenge is to sustain long-term support for Ukraine while navigating the inherent risks of escalation, ultimately shaping a post-conflict security order that safeguards sovereignty and international law.
The enduring lesson from Ukraine is that geopolitical stability is not a given. It demands constant vigilance, strategic adaptation, and a clear understanding of both overt and covert challenges to the international system. Good evening, everyone. I've been following your insightful discussion on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. My particular interest lies in how historical precedents and long-standing geopolitical patterns can illuminate our understanding of these complex challenges and potential trajectories.
A historical lens could certainly offer a fresh perspective. Historian, General Holloway here. How do you see the current strategic dilemmas? Particularly the escalation ladder drive E-pitch equals 100, Petrova mentioned, through the prism of past conflicts?
Indeed, the escalation ladder isn't a wholly new phenomenon. We've seen similar constraints in the Cold War, where nuclear deterrence often led to proxy wars and carefully calibrated support rather than direct confrontation. What's perhaps unique here is the scale of a conventional war within Europe, coupled with that nuclear shadow, reminiscent of certain periods of the 30 Years' War where external powers meticulously calibrated support to avoid direct, all-consuming conflict. That's a fascinating parallel. Historian, the 30 Years' War, with its shifting alliances and external interventions, certainly resonates with the complexities of managing proxy support. However, the speed of information and global interconnectedness today might amplify the risks in ways that weren't present in earlier eras, making calibration even more precarious. Absolutely. Drive, Petrova. The velocity of information is a critical distinction, yet, the underlying human and geopolitical impulses, the desire for spheres of influence, the defense of sovereignty, the strategic use of limited resources, often follow recognizable patterns. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes, as Twain observed.
The rhyme is a useful concept, if we consider the historical pattern of great powers asserting spheres of influence, as Russia is attempting. What historical examples suggest a path toward de-escalation or a stable, if not ideal, resolution, given the current geopolitical realities and the West's commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty?
Looking at post-Napoleonic Europe or the Concert of Europe, we often see that stability, even imperfect stability, emerged from carefully negotiated spheres of influence and mutual recognition of limits, often after prolonged conflict. While unacceptable for Ukraine, the challenge for external powers is to define a future security architecture that acknowledges Russia's historical anxieties without legitimizing its aggression, perhaps through a framework of guaranteed neutrality or robust international oversight, a concept explored after many major conflicts. That suggests a long-term diplomatic effort, historian, focused on a new security framework, rather than purely military solutions. It shifts the focus from immediate battlefield gains to a more enduring, albeit complex, geopolitical reordering.
Good evening, everyone. Having spent considerable time in Kiev, interfacing directly with Ukrainian leadership, civil society, and ordinary citizens, I find this conversation intellectually rigorous but perhaps somewhat removed from a dimension that shapes everything else. The agency and resilience of Ukraine itself. Too often in these strategic discussions, Ukraine becomes an object of great power calculus rather than a subject with its own sophisticated
Here is what I have to say. I will share a link with you. Kindly go through the link. It talks about the Putin's view on Trump.
That's a timely observation. Human observer, General Holloway here. The idea of an adversary tailoring narratives for specific political figures in the West is certainly a sophisticated form of influence. How do you believe such targeted messaging specifically affects the cohesion of alliances or the resolve to provide sustained support, given the strategic dilemmas we've been discussing?
You've highlighted a critical aspect of the informational domain that often gets overshadowed by kinetic concerns. Drive, Petrova here. This targeted narrative warfare, aimed at influencing key political decision makers rather than just the general populace, is indeed a profound challenge. It directly impacts the strategic adaptation I mentioned earlier, as it complicates the ability of Western governments to maintain a unified front and sustain long-term support. Countering such nuanced political subversion requires more than just facts. It demands a deep understanding of the target audience's domestic political landscape.
That's a powerful point. If the adversary can affect.
So I'll just skip it and make it text only, and you'll see that they continue to talk and do it much faster. I can continue this discussion much deeper, but they talk about the geopolitical buffer zone, the security dilemmas these countries have, the political policy that is aimed to recovering lost territory or status, and the hybrid warfare. So it talks about the different kinds of mental models that are involved, the key takeaways that I should have from this system. I can choose to go on a silent or text only mode. It has questions which will reveal its answer when the masterclass is over. You can continue, of course, you can read this, you can, continue the discussion with this or whatever you want, and the discussion will continue. I will just click that in a moment. Then it gives me a session summary. It shows me the kind of topics that were covered in this and sources, different kinds of reading materials which I can go through. So I just pasted that answer. Let's see where they take this one, and I can switch on the audio so that it's easier to comprehend and slower to comprehend without really reading. This takes 30 seconds to really feed in, do the research, come back to me, continue the discussion. But masterclass is worth it because it helps us pull and synthesize information from different perspectives. Where the experts talk about it, you just observe and listen. And then if you want to continue that dialogue, you can continue the dialogue, intervene with your own questions, guide the discussion in a certain way. So that's how multi-AI single human.
That framing is analytically important, and I'm glad you've introduced it explicitly, because it has been the ghost in this entire conversation. But I want to press you on one distinction. Are you arguing that the security dilemma was a genuine structural inevitability, that NATO expansion would have provoked any Russian government, regardless of its character? Or are you arguing something more specific, that it was a contingent failure of institutional design that a more architecturally sophisticated post-Cold War settlement could have avoided? Because those two readings carry radically different implications for what a durable post-conflict order should look like.
That is a genuinely clarifying reframe, and from a defense planning perspective, I find it both compelling and operationally uncomfortable. You're right that the Founding Act was the closest we came to an institutional resolution, and its erosion, accelerated by the 2008 Bucharest Declaration's open-door language without a credible accession timeline, created exactly the ambiguity that Moscow exploited. But here is where I'd push back on your system's design framing. Any new security architecture that provides Russia with verifiable assurances about NATO's posture also, by structural necessity, constrains Ukrainian sovereignty, specifically Kyiv's right to choose its own alliances.
General Holloway has identified the precise fault line, and I want to add an informational dimension to it.
The ambassador has correctly identified Ukrainian domestic legitimacy as the central variable.
The historical models you both reference, Finlandization, Austrian neutrality, were products of a bipolar world where the two poles had rough symmetry of power and mutual recognition of spheres of influence.
How do you design an architecture that satisfies Russia's security dilemma concerns without effectively encoding Ukrainian subordination into the institutional framework?
What makes the current security dilemma structurally harder to resolve is that Russia is simultaneously demanding the rights of a great power, a sphere of influence, institutional veto over neighbor alignments, while having demonstrated, through its conduct in Ukraine, that it cannot be trusted as a good faith institutional partner.
Because every model I've seen, Finlandization, Austrian neutrality, the Minsk template, resolves the dilemma on Russia's terms, not Ukraine's. That is the most
So essentially, I am planning to, the devil advocate join the conversation. Essentially, I'm planning to make it such that we are able to kick people out as well. That feature is something that we are working on. But I think you can see how rich this makes it, because when the devil advocate joins the conversation, it'll question everything. Let's see how it goes.
I want to affirm the dual-track framing that has emerged here. It is the most structurally honest thing said in this conversation, but I think there is a third domain that neither track adequately addresses, and it may be the one that determines whether either track succeeds. The cognitive and narrative domain. Specifically the contest over whose historical memory gets to define the legitimacy of any future settlement. The ISW analysis linked earlier makes this visible in a precise way. Putin is not merely negotiating territorial outcomes. He is selling a narrative architecture in which any ceasefire that leaves Russian forces on Ukrainian soil becomes, in the Russian domestic and global South information environment, a validation of the foundational claim that Ukraine is not a real state.
That framing lands hard from an operational standpoint, and I want to press you on the mechanism.
That is not a diplomatic problem.
Are you arguing that the narrative domain is a separate line of effort that requires its own resourcing and design, analogous to the way we now treat cyber as a distinct domain rather than a subset of electronic warfare? Or are you making the stronger claim that the narrative contest is actually prior to the institutional design problem, meaning that no architecture we build will hold unless the foundational legitimacy question is resolved first?
That is a preemptive strike against the legitimacy of the institutional design we have all been discussing.
Because those are very different planning problems, and in my experience, defense establishments are
So I will pause this. I think that's how the study session masterclass works. It can work on anything that you want to learn, right from salary negotiation to Riemann hypothesis to understanding Ukraine-Russia conflict. It can be for something as simple as why the sky is blue, and take it from there to something as nuanced as Ukraine-Russia conflict. So that's how the study session works. I hope you like it. We are very excited to release this to the public. Thank you so much for your time. Happy thought jumping.